It's a pleasure and an honor to get to kick off the set of conversations from those of us on the faculty here, particularly being from an immigrant background and how those shaped our experiences. I thought I'd start with a disclaimer, which is I am not a scientist, but I'm certainly engaged in science, as I'll talk about. And when I first thought of and looked at the list of people who were speaking and the country of origin, I thought, is Iran really my country of origin if I was born here and raised here? But as I thought about my narrative, I realized that indeed the fact that I'm an Iranian American, the fact that my parents came over from Iran in their 20s has really shaped a lot of my academic engagement, a lot of my career, and particularly my perception and outlook on life. And so I thought I would share with you both my family story, but also how that's shaped how I think about science, how I think about my academic career, and how I really am oriented in the field that I am in, which is at the intersection of science and society and science and ethics, and how I came to the ethical inquiries that I've landed on as the definition of my career. So first, my parents came to the United States in the late 1960s, 1969. Now, for those of you who are up on your Iranian history, that's not a particularly poignant moment in Iranian history. In fact, that was a relatively calm moment. And the reason that they came over at that time was because my father came here to do his medical residency. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about his history in a moment. But he came here in 1969. My mother joined him in 1970. They had met in Tehran at the major medical institution in Tehran because my mother was training to be a nurse, my father was training to be a physician, and they were married by proxy while my father was here in the United States. You probably have never met anybody else married by proxy. My mother actually married my father's uncle before she came over, but she came over in 1970 to join him after she finished her nursing degree. Their intention was always to go back to Iran. So he came here to do his residency, and at the time, in order to practice in Iran, you had to buy shares in the hospital. So as my father was earning his income, he was sending his money back to Iran to buy shares in the hospital, and they were planning on doing so. My older two sisters were born in New Jersey, where my parents were living, and my father was doing his residency during the time that he was buying shares in the hospital in Iran. And around 1978, when they intended to go back to Iran, they called up to the head of the cardiology wing of the hospital, who he had been in constant communication with, my father. And he said, you know what? You shouldn't come yet. You shouldn't come because the hospital isn't ready. And it would be a really, really bad idea for you to come back now. Now, if you think about the timing of that, what was going on in Iran was the Shah was about to flee and the revolution was about to begin. So my parents decided to wait a little while. They're still waiting. And they decided to stay in this country. They moved to a small town where I was born called Cheraw, South Carolina. And in Cheraw, South Carolina, I think a lot of their challenges in this country really began. When they were in New Jersey, there was a strong immigrant population of other physicians. It was a time in this country when we were really trying to recruit a lot of physicians from other countries because there was a shortage of trained professionals. My father graduated from the top of his class at the University of Tehran, the best medical university in Iran. A lot of the cohort who he was here with were similarly situated. But when they moved to Cheraw, South Carolina, that was not the case. Instead, they faced a significant amount of discrimination and a lot of really pushback, a lot of taunting, a lot of making fun of their accents, and just really difficult times while they were there. But I'm going to tell you a second anecdote before I tell you about that, which is another piece of my history that has also shaped my experiences. My parents, neither of them were particularly religious. They raised us Presbyterian because they thought it would just be good for us to believe in something, and so the mainstream church that was down the street was Presbyterian, and they thought, why not? But my grandmother on my mother's side was deeply religious, well before required in Iran to wear any sort of covering or chador. She would wear a chador because she believed deeply that it was part of her Islamic religion, that it was important for her to cover herself, that it showed piety, it showed deference, it showed respect. When the revolution happened, and after the Khomeini imposed the requirement that women had to wear headscarves and chadors and covering, she stopped wearing it except when she had to. And she said, instead of my religion, instead of this symbolism being a part of my identity, it's now a symbol of my oppression. And it is no longer something that I do willingly and as part of my expression of self. It is something that I now do as a requirement. And I remember my mother telling me this story and telling me why, the taking of a person's autonomy to be able to express their own views, their own religion, to do so on their own terms, had shaped so deeply somebody who had been so devout, had turned her against their own tenets of her religion because of an imposition rather than a free expression of self. And that also has significantly shaped how I think about the ability to believe and how you and an individual should be able to express their beliefs. A couple years later, my parents moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, where I grew up. And they moved there in 1979. Now, if you think back to your history as well as to what was happening in 1979, from 1979 to 1981, when my oldest sister was first enrolled in a small, elite private school in Charlotte, North Carolina, some students took over the U.S. Embassy in Iran, and there was a 444-day Iranian hostage crisis. Charlotte today is a relatively progressive place. Between the banks moving there, the sports teams moving there, a bunch of people from the north moving there, it has changed a lot. But at the time, it was a place that told my family to go back home. It was a place that gave my sister an incredibly difficult time in school, whose parents told the children not to be friends with my sisters because they were terrorists who were taking who were taking hostages within Iran. So I grew up with these kind of dueling things. Parents who had come here successful, and I promised you and I will tell you the story of my father in a moment, while facing significant discrimination and also seeing what the imposition of a revolution that cracked down on a country really did. This was a constant topic of conversation in my family and in my household. It made me relatively, if not deeply, suspicious of government, period. It made me deeply suspicious of the reasons that people come into control and come into power, and it made me question always, what are the motivations for people's behavior? Why is a government doing the things that it's doing? Is this the right way to limit a person's autonomy? Is this the right way to help a person express their sincerely held beliefs? Is every step that a person takes on a scientific endeavor, on a different inquiry, one that is motivated sincerely by their own beliefs? And how do we listen across the divides? If somebody's discriminating on one side against a family, do they have a different personal narrative to tell, and should we explore and find out what that is? I think it's led me to really ask questions about other. Who is self? Who is other? Who are the groups of people? To be much more sensitive to many different groups of people and to want to explore and to want to understand the different perspectives of different stakeholders. And that's become pivotal in what I do, which is to really think about the intersection between science and society, how science impacts society, how science impacts people. All right, so I promised I would tell you about my father. Many of us, from our parents, hear that about their trials and tribulations. I think I've heard from lots of different friends that their parents walked uphill both ways to school 6 miles each day, right? Well, when we were growing up, my father used to tell us this. He used to say, you don't know how great you have it. You don't appreciate what you have, because when I went to school, I had to walk uphill both ways 6 miles each way. When we point out to my father, you can't walk uphill both ways. If there's an uphill one way, there must be a downhill the other way. He'd say, no, you really don't understand. For the first time in my life, I went to Iran when I was in law school. And I met all of my extended family. I have 17 first cousins there. I have all of my aunts and uncles there. And I visited the town where my father was born and where he went to school until he was in the 6th grade. It was a very small village, and a very small village called Hosseiniya Farahany. Farahany means from Farahany. Farahany means from Farahany. And it was a village that didn't have running water, sewage, electricity. The small kind of huts that each of the homes were in were very modest. It was a one-room hut, basically, that my father lived in with his parents and with his 3 siblings. They had school that went through the 4th grade. And the 4th graders taught the 3rd graders, and the 3rd graders taught the 2nd graders, and the 2nd graders taught the 1st graders. And my father, who had parents who were illiterate, really, from the time he was quite young, believed in science and believed in medicine. He knew, for some reason, that he wanted to be a doctor. The closest school was 6 kilometers, not 6 miles away. And indeed, starting from the time he was in 4th grade, he did walk, mostly uphill both ways. It was a hilly walk to school until he got to 6th grade because he wanted to continue his education. He then, after that, his family moved to Arak, not Iraq, but Arak, A-R-A-K, because that was the place that had schooling that continued past 6th grade. My father went from there, from a family who could afford virtually nothing, to graduating the top of his class from the University of Tehran, the best school in Tehran, by taking an exam that enabled him on his merits to be able to succeed. He asked for help at every step of the way and received help at every step of the way in order to become a physician, which he so deeply believed in. He instilled in us that passion for science and for medicine and for helping other people. He helped us understand that you can come from virtually nothing, and if you believe in what comes next, what your calling is, how you can serve society better, that it may be possible to do so. And he did so, and he continues to do so. He recently retired from medicine a couple of years ago. He overcame a significant amount of discrimination in his service in medicine. When he was in Shiraz, South Carolina, he had the first integrated waiting room because he could simply not understand why you would have a waiting room that would separate people based on the color of their skin. And he was a revolutionary individual in many ways simply because of his beliefs and his own upbringing. I think that these different backgrounds enrich all of us. The fact that so many of us come from immigrant backgrounds, from immigrant households, from these different perspectives, these international perspectives, help us understand that we are all interconnected. When I applied to college, the quote that most inspired me and the title of my essay was, "Though I am different than you, we were born involved with one another." And I continue to believe that, which is, though we're different from each other, we are born deeply involved with one another. And if we understand how that will always be true, how science is something that can serve society, how society is the beneficiary and also the individuals who are at most risk of wrongdoings in science. I gave myself a timer. I think we will continue to be enriched and continue to understand the impact and the power that immigration has on science, on medicine, and on society. Thank you.